The heat of the late summer still clung to the air when the runner collapsed at the gates of Sparta, his feet torn and bleeding, his breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of a journey no mortal should have been forced to make. He had run from Thermopylae nearly 200 miles through mountain passes and hostile territory, carrying news that would transform grief into an engine of retribution, so terrible that the Persian Empire itself would tremble before it. The 300 were dead, every last one of them. King Leonidas lay headless somewhere on that cursed mountain pass, and Xerxes had ordered his corpse desecrated in a manner that violated every sacred law known to Hellenic civilization. The runner's words fell like stones into still water, and the ripples of rage that spread outward would not cease until they had drowned an empire in blood. In the homes of Sparta, wives who had known this outcome from the moment their husbands marched north began the preparations for vengeance with the same methodical precision their men had brought to warfare. There were no tears in Sparta, or if there were, they fell in darkness where no one could see them, because a Spartan woman did not weep for a husband who had died well. Instead, they sharpened their sons' resolve, reminded their remaining menfolk that 300 deaths demanded not mourning, but repayment in kind, multiplied until the scales of cosmic justice balanced once more. The agage, that brutal training system that transformed Spartan boys into instruments of war, intensified in ways that shocked even those who had endured it themselves. Every child over 7 years old understood that they were being forged into living weapons meant to avenge fathers and brothers who would never return. But Sparta's rage, however pure and terrible, could not alone overcome the vast Persian host that now occupied Greek soil like a plague of locusts, consuming everything in its path. Xerxes had brought with him not merely an army but entire nations, a migration of people so vast that rivers ran dry when they stopped to drink, and the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of their passage. The great king sat in Athens now, in the burned ruins of the Acropolis, offering amnesty to those who would submit and promising annihilation to those who would not, and his confidence seemed justified by every measure. He commanded perhaps 300,000 men, though numbers at this scale lost meaning and became more concept than reality, while the fractious Greek city-states could barely agree on the time of day, let alone coordinate a unified response to existential threat. What Xerxes failed to comprehend, what no Persian courtier raised in the suffocating atmosphere of absolute monarchy could comprehend, was that the 300 had transformed the entire calculus of Greek resistance. Before Thermopylae, the various city-states had viewed the Persian invasion as someone else's problem, a distant threat that might be appeased or avoided through careful diplomacy and strategic submission. After Thermopylae, after the news spread of how 300 Spartans and their allies had held the Persian millions for 3 days, after stories circulated of the mountain of Persian dead that Leonidas had built before he fell, resistance became not merely possible but mandatory, a sacred duty that transcended the petty rivalries and ancient feuds that normally governed Greek politics. Athens, burned and desecrated though it was, became the crucible in which Greek unity was finally forged. Themistocles, that cunning son of a minor noble family who had risen to prominence through sheer political genius, understood that the Persian fleet had to be destroyed before any land campaign could succeed, and he orchestrated the trap at Salamis with a subtlety that bordered on prophecy. He sent a trusted slave to Xerxes with false information, suggesting the Greek fleet was preparing to flee, knowing that the great king's pride and impatience would compel him to attack immediately in the narrow waters where Persian numerical superiority became a fatal disadvantage. The resulting naval battle shattered Persian sea power and forced Xerxes himself to flee back to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius with perhaps a third of the original invasion force and instructions to complete the conquest that now seemed considerably less inevitable than it had mere weeks before. Mardonius was no fool, and unlike his master, he understood that the Greeks could not be simply overwhelmed by numbers and intimidated into submission. He established winter quarters in Thessaly, that broad and fertile region in northern Greece where cavalry could operate effectively and where Persian gold could purchase allies among the always fractious Greek city-states. Throughout the winter of 480 to 479 BCE, his agents moved through the Greek world, offering extraordinary terms to any polis willing to mediate, promising autonomy and wealth beyond measure, in exchange for simple acknowledgement of Persian overlordship. Several cities wavered, not from cowardice but from rational calculation of costs and benefits, because the Persian offer was genuinely generous by the standards of ancient imperialism, and the alternative was annihilation. But Sparta would not waver, could not waver, because the 300 had purchased with their blood a debt that could only be repaid in Persian corpses. The ephors, those 5 annually elected magistrates who held power even over Spartan kings, understood that delay or diplomatic manoeuvring would be interpreted as weakness, and weakness would fracture the fragile Greek alliance faster than any Persian bribe. Yet Sparta faced a profound dilemma that spoke to the inherent contradictions of their entire social system. The Spartan state depended absolutely on the brutal subjugation of the Helots, those enslaved Greek populations who outnumbered their Spartan masters by perhaps 7 to 1, and who required constant military vigilance to keep suppressed. Every Spartan warrior who marched north to fight Persians was one fewer soldier available to prevent Helot rebellion, and the Helots, who possessed their own intelligence networks and political consciousness, understood this calculus perfectly well. The spring of 479 BCE arrived with agonizing slowness, and with it came urgent messages from Athens demanding Spartan military commitment before the city made separate peace with Mardonius. The Athenians were not bluffing, despite their recent heroics at Salamis, because their city lay in ruins, their population scattered to Salamis and Troezen, and the coming summer would bring starvation unless they could return to their fields and homes. Mardonius sweetened his offer, promising to rebuild Athens at Persian expense, to recognise Athenian hegemony over other Greek cities, to shower Themistocles himself with honours and wealth that would make him the most powerful man in Greece. The Athenian assembly debated these terms with genuine seriousness, not because they intended to accept, but because they needed Sparta to understand that Greek unity had a price, and that price was immediate military action. The Spartan response came in the form of 10,000 hoplites, marching north under the command of Pausanias, regent for Leonidas' young son, and a man who carried upon his shoulders not merely the weight of command, but the accumulated rage of an entire society that defined itself through military excellence, and now demanded vindication for its greatest humiliation. These were not the 300 chosen men of Thermopylae, but something potentially more dangerous, a substantial fraction of Sparta's full military might deployed beyond the Peloponnese for the first time in living memory, accompanied by 5,000 peroikoi, those free but not fully citizen communities that surrounded Sparta and provided crucial military support, and 35,000 helots armed as light infantry, in a calculated risk that spoke to the desperation of the moment. As this army moved north through the Peloponnese, it accumulated allies like a snowball rolling downhill, each city-state adding its contingent until the force numbered perhaps 100,000 men, though ancient sources vary wildly and likely exaggerate in both directions. What mattered was not the precise count but the unprecedented nature of the achievement, because Greeks had never before assembled an army of this scale under unified command, and the logistical challenges alone should have made the entire enterprise impossible. Feeding 100,000 men required approximately 300 tons of food daily, and the supply chain needed to sustain such consumption, while on the march through territory that Mardonius had deliberately devastated stretched Greek organisational capacity to its absolute limit. Pausanias demonstrated a gift for logistics that has been overshadowed by his later political failures and ultimate disgrace, because he understood that this army could not live off the land and could not afford to scatter for foraging lest it lose the cohesion that was its only advantage over the more numerous and cavalry-rich Persian force. He established supply depots along the route north, commandeered every cart and pack animal in the Peloponnese, and instituted rationing protocols that kept his men hungry but functional, which was precisely the state in which Greek hoplites fought most effectively. The Spartans themselves, accustomed to the brutal discipline of their communal messes and the black broth that served as their daily ration, found the march almost pleasant compared to their normal dietary regime, while the men from other cities grumbled but complied because Spartan officers enforced orders with a casual brutality that discouraged dissent. Mardonius received reports of this Greek mobilization with satisfaction rather than alarm, because he had spent the winter preparing the battlefield of his choice, and he believed, with considerable justification, that Greek hoplites were formidable in mountain passes and confined spaces, but vulnerable on open ground where Persian cavalry could envelop and destroy them. He had selected a position near Plataea in Boeotia, that region north of Athens where the land opened into broad plains perfect for cavalry operations, and he had spent months fortifying a camp that could house his entire army and serve as an unassailable base from which to dictate the terms of engagement. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Greeks would have to attack his fortified position or watch their army disintegrate from hunger and desertion, and when they attacked across open ground, his cavalry would shatter their flanks while his infantry pinned them in place. What Mardonius failed to appreciate was that Pausanias had studied the disaster at Thermopylae with obsessive attention to detail and understood that Greek victory required controlling the terrain and denying the Persians the opportunity to use their numerical and cavalry superiority. The young regent possessed none of Leonidas's legendary status or personal charisma, but he commanded something potentially more valuable, the largest Greek army ever assembled, and an iron determination not to waste the sacrifice of the 300 through hasty or ill-considered action. When Pausanias arrived at Plataea and surveyed the ground, he refused to give Mardonius the battle the Persian general had so carefully prepared, instead positioning his forces on the lower slopes of Mount Cithaeron, where rough ground negated cavalry advantage and where mountain springs provided reliable water sources that could not be easily interdicted. The two armies faced each other across the Asopus River for 11 days in a strategic stalemate that tested the patience and cohesion of both forces. Mardonius launched cavalry raids designed to provoke the Greeks into attacking or to disrupt their supply lines, sufficiently that hunger would accomplish what battle could not, and these raids achieved mixed success, destroying supply convoys and inflicting casualties, but never quite threatening the Greek position enough to force precipitate action. Persian cavalry archers would sweep forward in clouds, launch volleys of arrows into the Greek formations, then wheel away before the hoplites could close to effective combat range, a tactic that had worked brilliantly against less disciplined opponents, but which the Greeks endured through sheer stubborn courage and the protection offered by their large round shields and bronze armour. Among the Spartans positioned on the Greek right wing, the traditional place of honour that Pausanias had claimed by right of Spartan military supremacy, the enforced passivity of this phase chafed against every instinct their training had instilled. These men had been raised from childhood to close with the enemy, to crash into opposing lines with their shields and spears and grind forward through sheer disciplined violence until the enemy broke, or they themselves died, and this business of standing in formation while horse archers peppered them with arrows felt dishonourable, almost cowardly, despite its obvious tactical necessity. Officers moved among the ranks reminding their men that Leonidas had held position for 3 days at Thermopylae, that patience was itself a form of courage, that the 300 were watching from Hades and demanded not reckless bravery, but effective vengeance. On the 11th day, Mardonius ordered an elite cavalry unit to circle behind the Greek position and attack the mountain springs that supplied the army's water, a stratagem that succeeded beyond his expectations and transformed the strategic calculation overnight. The Persian cavalry managed to foul the springs so thoroughly that they became unusable, and simultaneously they positioned themselves to interdict any Greek attempt to access the Asopus River, which meant that 100,000 men would soon face desperate thirst unless Pausanias accepted battle on Mardonius's terms or retreated back toward the Peloponnese in an admission of defeat that would likely shatter the Greek alliance permanently. The Spartan regent called a council of war as the summer sun beat down on his increasingly desperate army, and the assembled generals understood that they faced one of those moments where every option was terrible, and leadership meant choosing which disaster to risk. Pausanias proposed a night withdrawal to a new position closer to Plataea itself, where multiple water sources would be available and where the terrain remained sufficiently broken to limit cavalry effectiveness, and after fierce debate the council agreed, though several generals argued that a night movement of an army this size courted chaos and potential catastrophe. The order went out as sunset approached, but the withdrawal that should have been a coordinated tactical repositioning instead devolved into something approaching panic, as contingents from different cities misunderstood their instructions or pursued their own agendas, and by dawn the Greek army had fractured into 3 separate groups scattered across several miles of countryside, exactly the situation that every competent commander dreaded when facing an enemy with superior cavalry. Mardonius received reports of the Greek withdrawal with undisguised joy, interpreting it as the beginning of a general retreat, and precisely the opportunity he'd been waiting for to destroy the Greek army in detail before it could escape or reform. He ordered an immediate general advance, personally leading his elite Persian infantry directly toward the Spartan position, because he understood that breaking Sparta would break Greek resistance entirely. And as the sun climbed higher on what would become one of history's pivotal days, the two forces that represented entirely different visions of human civilization moved toward collision with the inexorability of tectonic plates. The Spartans under Pausanias found themselves isolated from the rest of the Greek army, approximately 10,000 Spartan citizens and perioikoi facing perhaps 50,000 Persian troops, including the elite immortals, those supposedly invincible infantry who had earned their fearsome reputation across decades of successful campaigns. The historical moment balanced on a knife's edge, because if the Spartans broke or retreated, the entire Greek position would collapse, and Mardonius would achieve the decisive victory that would secure Persian control of Greece for generations. But if they held, if they could somehow withstand the Persian assault long enough for the scattered Greek contingents to rally and support them, then the impossible remained barely possible. Pausanias ordered his men into the standard phalanx formation, 8 men deep in a line that stretched perhaps half a mile, each warrior's shield overlapping with his neighbours to create a bronze wall bristling with 8-foot spears. And as the Spartans settled into the familiar stance that their training had made instinctive, something shifted in the collective psychology of the formation. These men had been raised from age 7 in a system designed to strip away individual identity and forge them into interchangeable components of a perfect military machine. And now that machine activated with smooth precision, despite the desperate tactical situation. The younger men in the front ranks felt fear, which was natural and human, but they also felt the presence of the men behind them, felt the weight of Spartan identity pressing them forward, felt the shades of the 300 watching and judging, and fear became fuel for the kind of controlled violence that had made Sparta synonymous with military excellence. The Persian advance came first as a sound, the thundering of thousands of feet and hooves, and then as a sight that should have broken the nerve of any mortal force, because Mardonius had committed virtually his entire infantry strength to this assault, and the mass of humanity rolling toward the Spartan line seemed less an army than a force of nature. Persian archers launched volley after volley of arrows in high-arcing trajectories designed to fall onto the Greeks from above, and the air itself seemed to darken with their passage, fulfilling the legendary boast attributed to the Persians before Thermopylae, that their arrows would block out the sun, to which a Spartan had supposedly replied that they would fight in the shade. The arrows clattered against bronze shields and helmets, found gaps in armour to punch through leather and flesh, and men fell screaming or silently depending on where they were struck. But the line held because the formation itself supported each individual, and made withdrawal more dangerous than holding position. Then the Persian infantry reached the Spartan line, and the nature of the combat transformed from the abstract violence of archery to the intimate brutality of close-quarters fighting. The Persians fought with shorter spears and lighter armour, prioritising mobility and individual skill, and under most circumstances these tactical choices served them well, but against the Spartan phalanx they proved catastrophically inadequate. The first Persian warriors to reach the Greek line found themselves facing a forest of 8-foot spears that could strike them down before their shorter weapons could reach their targets, and when they tried to push through or around the spears, they encountered the massive bronze-faced shields that Spartan warriors used not merely for defense, but as offensive weapons, slamming forward in coordinated pushes that could break bones and knock even brave men backward into the ranks behind them. The fighting developed its own horrible rhythm, as the Spartans advanced step by synchronized step, pushing forward over the bodies of the fallen while maintaining formation integrity with a discipline that seemed superhuman to those facing it. When a Spartan fell, the man behind him stepped forward to fill the gap instantly, and this seamless replacement of casualties meant that the formation never weakened, never showed the breach that might allow an enemy to exploit and roll up the line. The Persians fought with desperate courage because these were elite troops who had conquered most of the known world and who carried their own pride and tradition, but courage without the specific tactical advantages granted by the phalanx system could not overcome the mathematics of reach and armour that favoured the Greeks in this kind of combat. Mardonius himself rode among his troops, trying to rally them through personal example and the force of his legendary reputation, and for a time his presence stabilised the Persian line and prevented what could have become a rout. The general fought with the kind of reckless bravery that Persian military culture celebrated, dismounting to fight alongside his infantry when he saw them wavering, and his white horse became a banner around which Persian resistance coalesced. But sometime in the confused and bloody hours of mid-morning, a Spartan warrior whose name has not survived in the historical record hurled a javelin or thrust a spear into the mass of Persian nobles surrounding Mardonius, and the Persian general fell from his horse with a wound that would prove mortal. And with his fall, the entire character of the battle shifted. The death of Mardonius rippled through the Persian army like poison through a bloodstream because ancient armies depended on personal leadership in ways that modern command structures with their communications technology and institutional continuity do not. And when the commanding general fell, especially when he fell fighting in the front ranks, where everyone could see, the psychological impact could shatter even veteran troops. The Persian infantry that had been pressing forward desperately against the Spartan line suddenly found reasons to step back, to disengage, to look for escape routes, and as the withdrawal began, it accelerated with catastrophic speed into a full retreat toward the fortified camp that Mardonius had constructed months earlier as his base of operations. The Spartans pursued with methodical violence, not breaking formation to chase individual fleeing enemies in the way that less disciplined troops might have done, but advancing at a steady pace that maintained their tactical advantages while denying the Persians any opportunity to rally or reform. This measured pursuit demonstrated exactly why Spartan military training emphasized collective discipline over individual heroics, because the phalanx that maintained cohesion during pursuit could continue killing efficiently while protecting itself from counterattack, whereas troops that scattered to pursue fleeing enemies became vulnerable to the very cavalry threat that still lurked on the battlefield's periphery. Meanwhile, the other Greek contingents scattered across the battlefield by the confused night withdrawal began to comprehend that something extraordinary was happening on the Spartan wing and started moving to support their allies or to attack the portions of the Persian army that Mardonius had not committed to the assault on the Spartans. The Athenians, under their general Aristides, that politician whose nickname the Just suggested both his reputation and the moral certainty with which he approached warfare, found themselves facing the Theban contingent that had Medized, had chosen alliance with Persia over loyalty to fellow Greeks, and the resulting combat carried an edge of civil war hatred that made it particularly vicious. Greek fought Greek with an intensity born of betrayal and conflicting visions of political organisation, because Thebes had chosen what it saw as a realistic accommodation with overwhelming power while Athens had gambled everything on resistance. And now that gamble appeared to be paying off in ways that made the Theban choice look both cowardly and strategically incompetent. The Persian fortified camp that had seemed so formidable when Mardonius constructed it proved inadequate when actually tested by determined assault, because the Persians had designed it primarily to defend against cavalry raids and small-scale attacks rather than against sustained assault by heavy infantry, willing to absorb casualties to achieve breakthrough. The wooden walls and shallow ditches that ring the camp channeled the Greek advance without stopping it, and when the Spartans reached the barriers they demonstrated the same brutal competence they had shown in the open field fighting, using their shields to create platforms and ladders while spearmen kept Persian defenders from concentrating against any particular point of attack. The fall of the Persian camp transformed the battle into a massacre, as the organised retreat collapsed into desperate flight and the various Greek contingents converged on the fortifications from multiple directions, trapping tens of thousands of Persian and Medizing Greek troops with limited escape routes. What followed violated the heroic narratives that Greek poets would later construct around the battle, because the killing became industrial rather than heroic, a systematic slaughter of men who could no longer effectively resist, and who died not in glorious single combat, but crushed in panicked crowds or cut down from behind as they fled. The Spartans, whose entire society oriented around warfare, and who possessed none of the democratic squeamishness about violence that occasionally troubled Athenians, pursued the killing with cold efficiency until the sun began to set, and exhaustion, rather than mercy, finally ended the day's work. Ancient sources claim that perhaps 200,000 Persians and their allies died at Plataea, which is almost certainly a massive exaggeration. But even if we reduce that figure by half or two-thirds, the scale of Persian losses was catastrophic and represented the effective destruction of the invasion force that Xerxes had left in Greece under Mardonius's command. The Greek losses, by contrast, were remarkably light considering the day's desperate circumstances, with perhaps 10,000 killed across the entire army, and proportionally fewer among the Spartans whose superior armour and discipline had protected them even in the desperate fighting against Mardonius's assault. The mathematical reality of this casualty disparity spoke to the fundamental advantage that heavy infantry possessed when fighting on favourable terrain against opponents lacking comparable equipment and tactical systems, and it validated the extraordinary investment that Greek city-states made in armour and training, despite the economic burden that such investment imposed. In the aftermath of the battle, as the Greeks moved through the Persian camp, collecting spoils and executing prisoners according to the brutal customs of ancient warfare, they discovered the logistical infrastructure of the Persian expedition and gained insight into exactly how the invasion had been organised and supplied. The sheer quantity of gold and silver in the Persian baggage train shocked even the most optimistic Greeks, because Xerxes had brought with him not merely an army, but the accumulated wealth of the largest empire the world had yet seen, and the distribution of this plunder among the Greek allies provided both immediate economic benefit and longer-term corruption that would poison inter-Greek relations for generations. Pausanias ordered that specific portions of the treasure be set aside for dedications to the gods at Delphi and Olympia, understanding that visible religious gratitude would bolster his political position and reinforce the interpretation of the victory as divinely ordained rather than merely tactically competent. The Spartan commander also made decisions in the battle's immediate aftermath that revealed both his strategic insight and his limitations as a political leader, because he ordered that the Persian camp's luxurious contents be prepared as a banquet, and then invited the Greek commanders to witness the contrast between Persian extravagance and Spartan austerity, supposedly declaring that he wanted to show them the folly of men who lived so well yet came to rob Greece of its poverty. This gesture contained genuine philosophical insight into the relationship between luxury and military effectiveness, but it also demonstrated a tone-deafness about how non-Spartans might interpret such moralizing, particularly when delivered by the commander who now controlled access to unprecedented wealth. The seeds of Pausanias' later downfall, his eventual attempt to establish himself as a tyrant and his resulting execution by his own city, were already visible in these early displays of arrogance poorly masked as virtue. For the 10,000 Spartans who had marched north under Pausanias' command, the victory at Plataea represented something more profound than tactical success or territorial gain, because it had redeemed the sacrifice of the 300 and validated the entire Spartan social system in the most public and unambiguous way possible. The men who had stood in the phalanx that morning, who had felt the Persian assault break against their shields and spears, who had advanced step by step over the bodies of their enemies until the entire Persian army shattered and fled, these men had proven that the brutal training of the agoge, the sacrifice of normal family life, the subjugation of helots to free Spartan citizens for warfare, all of it had been justified by this moment when Sparta had saved not merely itself, but the entire Greek world from Persian domination. Yet even in this moment of supreme triumph, contradictions and complications lurked beneath the surface celebration. The helots who had accompanied the army as light infantry had fought and died alongside their Spartan masters, had shared in the victory and the danger, and some of them expected that such service might lead to manumission or improve status within the rigid Spartan social hierarchy. These expectations would be disappointed in ways that would eventually generate the military crisis that destroyed Spartan power a century and a half later. Because Sparta's commitment to maintaining absolute social hierarchy proved stronger than any gratitude for wartime service. The system that made Sparta militarily supreme also made it politically inflexible and ultimately fragile, dependent on continuous military success to suppress the internal contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. The Perioikoi who had fought in the battle experienced their own complex response to the victory, because they had contributed substantially to the Greek success, but remained second-class citizens within the Spartan system, free and self-governing in limited ways but always subordinate to Spartan authority, and always conscious that their military value was the primary reason Sparta tolerated their semi-autonomous status. Some Perioikoi communities would eventually rebel against Spartan control, though not for decades after Plataea, and the victory that seemed to validate Spartan supremacy also revealed the dependence of that supremacy on the cooperation of subordinate populations who had their own interests and agendas. The distribution of credit for the Greek victory generated immediate controversy that would poison inter-Greek relations and contribute to the eventual catastrophe of the Peloponnesian War, because the Spartans claimed primary honour for the victory on grounds that they had faced and defeated the elite Persian troops under Mardonius himself, while the Athenians argued that their earlier victory at Salamis had made Plataea possible, and that their overall strategic vision deserved recognition equal to or greater than Spartan battlefield performance. This argument about historical interpretation and proper credit was not merely academic pride, but had immediate practical implications for leadership of the ongoing war against Persia and for the political organisation of Greece itself, and it proved fundamentally irresolvable because both positions contained substantial truth, and both cities possessed enough military power to enforce their interpretation through violence if necessary. The religious dimension of the victory added another layer of complexity to its political ramifications, because the Greeks universally interpreted their success as evidence of divine favour and divine intervention in human affairs, and the question of which gods deserved primary credit and which cities had been especially favoured by divine protection became inseparable from questions of political leadership and moral authority. The Spartans emphasized their special relationship with Apollo and argued that their victory vindicated their conservative social system and their rejection of the democratic innovations that Athens celebrated, while the Athenians pointed to Athena's evident favour demonstrated at Salamis, and argued that their democratic institutions had proven more effective at organising collective resistance than Sparta's oligarchic militarism. In the days following the battle, the Greek allies established a common fund from the Persian spoils and swore a collective oath to continue the war against Persia, to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor that remained under Persian control, and to never rebuild the temples that the Persians had burned, but to leave them as permanent reminders of Persian sacrilege and Greek resistance. This oath, known to history as the Oath of Plataea, though its historical authenticity remains debated by modern scholars, represented an attempt to transform the temporary cooperation forced by existential threat into permanent political and military unity. And like most such attempts, it failed rather quickly, once the immediate danger receded and the normal patterns of Greek political fragmentation reasserted themselves. The burial of the dead after Plataea followed Greek custom with mass cremations and the construction of burial mounds for each city's fallen, and these mounds became pilgrimage sites and focal points for civic memory, in ways that reinforced both collective Greek identity and the particular pride of individual cities. The Spartans buried their dead in 3 separate mounds, one for the Spartiates who had died as full citizens, one for the Perioikoi, and one for the Helots. And this segregation of the honoured dead according to social status, even in death, demonstrated the rigidity of Spartan social hierarchy and foreshadowed the ways that such rigidity would eventually undermine Spartan power. The Athenians, by contrast, buried all their dead together regardless of social class, and this democratic approach to honouring the fallen became part of Athens' ideological self-presentation as a more egalitarian and inclusive society than its militaristic rival. The news of the victory at Plataea spread through the Greek world with remarkable speed despite the limitations of ancient communications technology, carried by official messengers and unofficial travellers, by merchants and sailors, by slaves and priests, until every Greek-speaking community from Sicily to the Black Sea knew that the impossible had occurred, that the Persian invasion had been definitively defeated, that the future would not be one of Persian domination but of continued Greek independence and internecine conflict. The psychological impact of this news varied dramatically depending on each community's particular circumstances and its relationship to the major powers, because cities that had Mediaized, that had submitted to Persia or actively supported the invasion, now faced retribution from their fellow Greeks and needed to rapidly recalculate their political positions. Thebes, which had fought alongside Persia at Plataea and whose troops had been among the last to retreat from the battlefield, faced immediate siege by the vengeful Greek army and ultimately surrendered its pro-Persian leaders for execution in a desperate attempt to avoid destruction of the city itself. The trial and execution of these Theban leaders established precedents about collaboration and treason that would echo through Greek political discourse for centuries, because it raised fundamental questions about whether communities could be held collectively responsible for the decisions of their governments, and whether punishing Medism might create cycles of revenge that would prevent post-war reconciliation. The strategic situation in the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world shifted dramatically in the months following Plataea as the news reached more distant communities, and as the Persian Empire attempted to process the magnitude of its defeat. Xerxes himself, safe in his palaces in Susa and Persepolis, received the news of Mardonius' death and the destruction of his European army with a combination of rage and calculation, because the great king needed to determine whether the investment of additional resources into reconquering Greece made strategic sense, or whether Persian interests would be better served by consolidating control of more economically valuable territories in Egypt and the eastern satrapies. The decision to effectively abandon the Greek campaign, to maintain only a defensive posture in Ionia, and to focus Persian energies elsewhere, represented a rational strategic choice that acknowledged the limited economic value of Greece compared to the enormous costs that continued military operations would entail. For the Spartans who had avenged their 300 at Plataea, the victory brought both glory and unexpected complications, because success transformed their role within the Greek world in ways that stressed their conservative social system. Sparta had traditionally avoided extensive overseas commitments and foreign entanglements, preferring to dominate the Peloponnese and maintain internal control over the Helots. But the prestige earned at Plataea made this isolationist approach increasingly untenable as other Greek cities looked to Sparta for leadership in the continuing war against Persia. The resulting tension between Sparta's traditional domestic focus and the new expectations of Pan-Hellenic leadership would shape Greek politics for the next 2 generations, and ultimately contribute to the catastrophic conflict between Sparta and Athens that devastated the Greek world. The individual Spartans who had fought at Plataea returned to their homes and resumed their austere daily routines, participating in the common messes and training exercises that defined Spartan citizenship. But they carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in one of history's pivotal battles, that they had fulfilled the debt owed to the 300 in the most complete and public way possible. For these men, the memory of Plataea became a defining touchstone of identity, a moment when all the sacrifice and discipline and subordination of individual desire to collective purpose had been vindicated by overwhelming success, and they would measure all subsequent events against this standard, finding most of them wanting in comparison. The broader Greek world experienced Plataea as confirmation that resistance to apparently overwhelming power was possible, that small communities of free citizens fighting for their homes and their autonomy could defeat vast imperial armies fighting for the ambitions of a distant monarch, and this lesson became foundational to Greek political thought and self-conception. The contrast between Greek freedom and Persian slavery, which was vastly oversimplified and in many ways historically inaccurate given the substantial unfreedom that existed within Greek societies and the substantial administrative autonomy that Persian satrapies enjoyed, nevertheless became a central organizing principle of Greek identity and provided ideological justification for continued resistance to Persian influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. The material consequences of the victory manifested in multiple ways beyond the immediate distribution of Persian spoils, because the elimination of the Persian threat allowed Greek commerce to expand, permitted Athens to invest in building the walls and fleet that would make it a major power, and created the political and economic conditions for the remarkable cultural flowering that we associate with classical Greece. The Parthenon, the philosophical schools, the dramatic festivals, the historical and scientific investigations that characterized 5th century Athens would likely have been impossible under Persian domination or in a Greece that had exhausted itself in prolonged resistance to Persian occupation, and in this sense, Plataea's consequences extended far beyond military history into the realm of human cultural achievement. Yet the price of this Greek victory included not merely the casualties at Plataea and the other battles of the Persian wars, but the longer-term costs of militarization and inter-Greek rivalry that the war generated, because the martial culture that defeated Persia proved difficult to redirect toward peaceful purposes once the external threat receded, and the competition for leadership between Sparta and Athens that had been manageable during the war against Persia became increasingly violent and destructive once that common enemy no longer imposed cooperation. The Peloponnesian War that eventually erupted between these rival alliance systems can be traced in part to patterns and grievances that originated in the Persian Wars period, and in this sense the 10,000 Spartans who avenged the 300 at Plataea also inadvertently set in motion the processes that would eventually destroy classical Greek civilization. The commemoration of Plataea through monuments and annual celebrations became an important part of Greek civic religion and collective memory, providing occasions for communities to reaffirm their commitment to freedom and to honour those who had died defending it. But these commemorations also became sites of political contest where different interpretations of the battle's meaning and different claims about who deserved primary credit could be publicly asserted and debated. The Spartans emphasized their role as the decisive force that broke the Persian army. The Athenians emphasized their earlier naval victory and their ideological leadership, and other Greek cities tried to insert their own contingents into the narrative in ways that would justify claims to honor and influence in post-war Greek politics.